I never wanted to be that guy, the suspicious husband, the one who combs through phone records or smells his wife's clothes for another man's cologne. I prided myself on being trusting, on believing in my marriage. After all, wasn't trust the foundation of everything? But trust is fragile. And once a crack forms, it spreads like a disease. For months, something had been gnawing at me, an itch I couldn't scratch. My wife, Laura, had changed. It was subtle at first, small things, like checking her phone more often or staying late at work for meetings that never seemed to end. But over time, those little things piled up. She started dressing differently, wearing perfume I hadn't smelled on her in years. And the worst part? She was happy. Not the kind of happy that comes from a good day at work or a fun weekend with family. No, this was something else, something deeper. A glow in her cheeks, a lightness in her step. And the worst part was, I knew that happiness had nothing to do with me. I couldn't prove anything, though. Every time I brought up my concerns, she had an answer. "You're imagining things," she'd say with a smile, kissing me on the cheek. "You work too hard, love. Maybe take a break?" And maybe she was right. Maybe I was overthinking. But doubt doesn't die easily. That's when I reached out to Ethan. Ethan and I had been friends since college, though life had pulled us in different directions. He moved to another city, got married, divorced, and now worked as a freelance investigator. The perfect guy to call when you needed information. We met at a bar downtown, the kind of place where no one asked questions. "You're serious about this?" Ethan asked, sipping his whiskey. I nodded, my hands tightening around my glass. "I need to know the truth." Ethan exhaled, considering. "You sure you want the truth?" That question sat heavy between us. But I already knew the answer. "I need proof," I said. "One way or another." He leaned back, rubbing his chin. "All right. Tell me everything." I laid it out for him. How Laura always took a taxi home from work, how she was suddenly so secretive, how I could feel something slipping between us. "She's sleeping with someone," I said, the words tasting like poison. "I just don't know who." Ethan nodded, his mind already working. "Then we set a trap." I raised an eyebrow. "What kind of trap?" Ethan smirked. "One she won't see coming." And that's when we started planning. Ethan was thorough, that was one of the things I always admired about him. He didn't just come up with a plan, he crafted a masterpiece. "We need a controlled environment," he said, tapping his fingers on the bar top. "Something natural. Something she won't question." That's when I told him about the taxi. Every evening, Laura took a cab home from work. She claimed it was because parking downtown was too expensive and traffic was a nightmare. Fair enough. But what if we could use that routine against her? Ethan's eyes gleamed. "Perfect. We'll use my car." He explained his idea. We would rig his car with hidden cameras, small, undetectable ones that would capture every angle. Then, Ethan himself would be the bait. "She doesn't know me," he pointed out. "That works in our favor. I can pose as a taxi driver, make small talk, see how she reacts." I clenched my jaw. "And if she takes the bait?" Ethan met my gaze, his expression serious. "Then you'll have your proof." That night I barely slept. I kept glancing at Laura, watching the slow rise and fall of her breath as she slept beside me. Was I crazy? Was I ruining my marriage over paranoia? But then I remembered the way she smiled at her phone when she thought I wasn't looking. The way she smelled different. The way she felt distant. No, this wasn't paranoia. This was a gut feeling. And I was done ignoring it. The next day, Ethan worked fast. He installed the cameras in his car, one under the rearview mirror, another in the air vent, and a third near the center console. They were small, discreet, and would capture everything. That evening, he stationed himself near Laura's office. She usually left work around 6:30, so he parked nearby, pretending to scroll through his phone. At exactly 6:32, Laura stepped outside. She was on her phone, laughing at something, probably a message from him. My hands clenched into fists as I watched the live feed from the cameras. Ethan's phone was connected to them, and he was sharing the feed with me in real time. He pulled up to the curb, rolled down the window, and called out in a friendly voice. "Need a ride?" Laura hesitated, then glanced at her phone. After a moment's consideration, she smiled. "Sure," she said, sliding into the passenger seat. And just like that, my heart began to crack. I watched everything unfold in real time. Laura sat in the passenger seat, adjusting her skirt as she got comfortable. Ethan kept his voice light, casual. "Long day?" he asked as he pulled away from the curb. Laura sighed, rubbing her temple. "You have no idea." Ethan chuckled. "I can imagine. I get a lot of tired passengers." She smiled at that. A real smile. The kind she hadn't given me in months. I gritted my teeth and forced myself to stay calm. Ethan continued the conversation, keeping things friendly but personal. "So, do you usually take a taxi home?" Laura nodded. "Yeah, every night." "Must be expensive," he said. She shrugged. "It's worth it. My husband works late a lot, so it's easier this way." Hearing her mention me was like a slap to the face. But she said it so casually, so easily. There was no warmth in her voice, no affection. Just a fact she barely cared to acknowledge. Ethan glanced at her through the rearview mirror. "That's tough. Long hours can put a strain on things, huh?" Laura hesitated. "Yeah," she admitted. "They can." I leaned forward, gripping my phone like it was the only thing keeping me grounded. "Ever get tempted?" Ethan asked smoothly. Laura turned to look at him. "Tempted? To, find other ways to deal with the loneliness." My heart slammed against my ribs as I waited for her response. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she bit her lip, glancing out the window like she was weighing something in her mind. Then she turned back to him and smiled. "Sometimes." A slow, knowing smile spread across Ethan's face. "I get that." Laura let out a soft laugh. "I bet you do." I felt like the air had been knocked out of my lungs. Ethan adjusted his grip on the wheel. "So, how far is home?" Laura held his gaze for a second longer than necessary. Then she shifted in her seat, running a hand through her hair. "I'm in no rush." I stopped breathing. Ethan chuckled. "Good to know." And with that, he turned the car away from our neighborhood. Away from our home. She didn't object. She didn't even ask where they were going. I already had my answer. And it destroyed me. I sat in my car, gripping my phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. The screen showed the live feed from the hidden cameras. Laura, leaning slightly toward Ethan, her body language relaxed, open. She was flirting. With a stranger. With him. I could barely breathe. Ethan kept up the act, keeping his tone smooth, easygoing. "So, what does your husband do?" Laura exhaled, staring out the window for a moment. "Tech. He's smart. Focused. A little too focused sometimes." Ethan glanced at her. "That sounds complicated." She gave a small, sad smile. "It is." I felt something inside me crack. Complicated? Was that what she called our marriage now? Was that her justification? Ethan took a slight turn, slowing down as he entered a quieter part of the city. The roads were darker here, less traffic, fewer streetlights. A place where no one would see what happened. Laura didn't seem to notice. Or maybe she didn't care. "You're easy to talk to," she said, tilting her head toward him. "Not a lot of guys are like that." Ethan chuckled. "I try my best." She laughed, and I swear it was a sound I hadn't heard in years. A light, playful kind of laugh. Not forced. Not polite. Real. And it wasn't for me. Ethan pulled into an empty parking lot and put the car in park. Then he turned to her. "You sure you don't need to go home just yet?" Laura hesitated. For a second I thought, hoped, she would say no. That she would snap out of whatever spell she was under and remember who she was. Who we were. But then she tucked her hair behind her ear, leaned slightly closer, and whispered the words that shattered me completely. "I don't mind staying a little longer." My entire world collapsed. I felt like I was drowning. The live feed showed everything: Laura shifting in her seat, her fingers toying with the hem of her skirt, her eyes locked onto Ethan. The hesitation I had clung to, the last shred of hope that she would stop herself, was gone. She had chosen this. She had chosen to betray me. Ethan leaned in slightly, his voice low. "You sure?" Laura bit her lip, her gaze flicking to his. And then, in the softest, most breathless voice I had ever heard her use, one she hadn't used on me in years, she whispered, "Yes." The words sent a shockwave through my entire body. Ethan hesitated, giving her one last chance to back out. "If we do this, there's no going back." Laura exhaled slowly, her hand brushing against his arm. "Then let's not think about it." I slammed my fist against the dashboard, my breathing ragged. I couldn't watch anymore. I had seen enough. My wife, the woman I had loved, trusted, built a life with, had fallen into the trap without a second thought. The video would keep recording, capturing every damning second, but I didn't need to see it. I had already lost her. And if she thought I would suffer in silence, she was dead wrong. Laura had no idea what was coming. But she would soon. Ethan sent me the footage later that night. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I already knew what it contained. Instead, I sat in the dark, staring at the wall, my mind a hurricane of emotions: rage, disgust, heartbreak. I thought I'd be prepared for this, but nothing could have prepared me for the reality of it. She hadn't hesitated. She hadn't even struggled with the decision. I had spent years believing in Laura, trusting in the life we built. But in the span of a single car ride, she had proven that none of it had meant anything to her. Ethan called. "You all right?" I swallowed the bitter laugh that rose in my throat. "Do I sound all right?" There was silence on the other end. "I'm sorry, man. I really am." I closed my eyes, pressing my fingers to my temples. "She didn't even try to resist." "No," Ethan admitted. "She didn't." That hurt more than anything. I could have convinced myself that she was manipulated, pressured, conflicted. But she wasn't. She wanted this. And that meant she had been capable of it all along. I exhaled slowly. "It's time." Ethan's voice turned serious. "You sure?" "Yes." My grip tightened around my phone. "We're doing it exactly as planned." I wasn't going to confront her in some pathetic, emotional outburst. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of my pain. No, I was going to destroy her. She had no idea what was coming. But by the time I was done, she would wish she had never made that choice. The first step was control. If I let my emotions dictate my actions, I'd lose. I had to be smarter than that. Laura had already made her choice, now it was my turn. Ethan and I went over the plan in detail. The footage was my weapon, but I wouldn't use it yet. Not directly. No, first I needed to shake her world, subtly, methodically. I wanted her to feel the pressure before she even knew what was happening. So I started small. The next morning, I acted normal. Too normal. I greeted her the way I always did, kissed her on the cheek, asked about her day. She smiled, but there was something hesitant in her expression, like she was checking for cracks in my mask. "Good." At breakfast, I casually asked, "So, how was work yesterday?" Laura didn't even flinch. "Long meetings all day." A lie. So smooth, so effortless. I nodded, pretending to believe her. After she left for work, I made my real move. Step 1: control the finances. Laura had access to our joint account, but I handled most of the bills. Over the next few days, I quietly transferred money into a private account she didn't know about. Not enough to be obvious, but enough to prepare. Step 2: social pressure. I reached out to a few close friends, people who had known us for years. I didn't tell them outright, but I planted the seeds. "You ever notice Laura acting different lately?" I asked casually over drinks. Frowns. Concerned glances. One of them hesitated before admitting. Now that you mention it, yeah? She's been kinda distant. I nodded, feigning uncertainty. I just want to make sure everything's okay. By the time Laura realized people were looking at her differently, it would be too late. Step 3. The cracks begin to show. A few days later, I left my phone on the kitchen counter, screen unlocked, with a carefully chosen message open for her to see. A fake text conversation between Ethan and me. Ethan, did you tell her yet? Me. Not yet. Soon. I watched from the hallway as Laura walked in, glanced at my phone, and froze. She stood there for a long moment, staring at the screen. Then she slowly backed away, pretending she hadn't seen anything. But I saw the way her hands shook as she made her coffee. The doubt had been planted. Laura thought she was in control. She was wrong. Laura was unraveling, and I could see it. She wasn't sleeping as well. I noticed the way she glanced at me when she thought I wasn't looking, how she hesitated before answering simple questions. The weight of her guilt, or at least the fear of being caught, was pressing down on her. Good. A week after the taxi ride, I decided it was time for the next phase. I needed her to feel trapped, uncertain, watched. It started with the anonymous messages. I used a burner phone, sending short, cryptic texts at random times of the day. Nothing direct, just enough to make her paranoid. Unknown number. Does your husband know? Laura read it while sitting next to me on the couch. She flinched so hard she nearly dropped her phone. I pretended not to notice. She quickly locked her screen, shifting in her seat, her breathing unsteady. The next day, another message. Unknown number. Secrets don't stay hidden forever. She was checking her phone every few minutes now, eyes darting around the room like she expected someone to be watching. At dinner that evening, she barely touched her food. I played my part perfectly, acting clueless, chatting about my day while she sat there, pale and silent. Then, as I poured myself another drink, I casually said, "You seem distracted lately. Something on your mind?" She nearly choked on her water. "No," she said quickly. Too quickly. "Just work stress." Another lie. I smiled. "You sure? You'd tell me if something was wrong, wouldn't you?" She forced a smile, nodding. "Of course." She was terrified. And I wasn't done yet. That night, while she showered, I left another message on her phone. Unknown number. You should be honest with him. Before it's too late. Laura barely slept that night. Neither did I. I was too busy savoring the fear in her eyes. Laura was falling apart, and I enjoyed every second of it. The next morning, she barely spoke. She fidgeted with her coffee mug, her eyes distant, her fingers trembling slightly as she scrolled through her phone. I knew what she was looking for, some clue as to who was sending the messages. Some way to make it stop. But she had no idea where they were coming from. And that was the point. She left for work an hour early. No explanation. Just a quick kiss on the cheek, forced, hesitant, and a muttered, "I'll see you later." I watched her go, then picked up my phone and sent another message. Unknown number. Running won't change what you did. By the time she got to her office, I knew she'd be on the verge of breaking. But I wasn't done yet. I made another move that afternoon, something to push her over the edge. I called one of her closest friends, Megan, someone she confided in, someone who had been in our lives for years. "Megan," I said casually, as if I wasn't setting the stage for Laura's complete destruction. "Has Laura seemed off to you lately?" Megan hesitated. "What do you mean?" I sighed. "I don't know. Just distant. Distracted. Like she's hiding something." There was a long pause before Megan finally said, "You know, I have noticed something." That was all I needed. Once doubt spread through her circle, Laura would start to feel completely alone. By the time she got home that night, she looked exhausted. "Long day?" I asked as I set a glass of wine in front of her. She nodded slowly, rubbing her temple. "Yeah. You sure? I tilted my head slightly, watching her reaction. You seem distracted. She froze for half a second before forcing a laugh. Just work stress. Same lie. Different day. I smiled, taking a slow sip of my drink. Laura was breaking. And the final blow was coming soon. The moment had finally arrived. Laura was barely holding herself together. She jumped at every notification on her phone. Her hands shook when she thought I wasn't looking, and the tension in the house had become unbearable. She wasn't sleeping. She wasn't eating properly. She was waiting. Waiting for the hammer to drop. And I was going to make sure it landed with devastating force. That evening, I set the final trap. I waited until after dinner, when we were both sitting in the living room, the air thick with unspoken words. Laura was scrolling through her phone, pretending to be relaxed. I pulled out my phone and sent the last message. Unknown number, he knows. I watched her read it. Her whole body stiffened. Her breathing became shallow, and she turned completely pale. She clutched the phone so tightly I thought she might break it. Then, slowly, she turned to look at me. Ryan! Her voice was barely above a whisper. I took a sip of my drink, keeping my expression unreadable. She hesitated, searching my face for any sign that I was the one behind the messages. But she found nothing. Because I had already won. She swallowed hard. I need to tell you something. I set my glass down and leaned back. Go on. Her lip quivered. Before she could speak, I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and tapped the screen. The TV lit up. And the footage played. Laura gasped as the screen filled with images of her in Ethan's car, her flirtation, her betrayal, every moment captured in crystal clear detail. The sound of her own voice echoed through the room. Sometimes. I don't mind staying a little longer. She clapped a hand over her mouth, eyes wide with horror. I let the footage play a little longer, just enough to let the reality sink in, before I finally spoke. You were saying? Laura's entire body shook as she turned to me, tears already spilling down her cheeks. Ryan, please. I can explain. I laughed. Actually laughed. A bitter, cold sound. Oh, I'd love to hear this. She reached for me, but I pulled away. It didn't mean anything. She sobbed. It was a mistake. I wasn't thinking. I held up a hand, cutting her off. No. You were thinking. You had a choice, Laura. And you made it. Her breath hitched. Don't. My voice was ice. Don't insult me with excuses. I know exactly who you are now. Tears streamed down her face as she realized there was no escape. I stood, grabbed my jacket, and walked to the door. Before I left, I turned back to her one last time. You destroyed this marriage, Laura. My voice was calm, measured. Final. Now you get to live with the consequences. And with that, I walked out, leaving her sobbing in the wreckage of everything she had ruined. But this wasn't over. Not yet. If you want more stories like this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.